and webinar on European higher education students' contested constructions, which will be delivered by Professor Rachel Brooks, who's a Professor of Sociology and Associate Dean for Research and Innovation at the University of Surrey. And she's also Editor-in-Chief of Sociology and Executive Editor of the British Journal of Sociology of Education and co-editor of the Rutledge SRHE Research in Higher Education book series. She's published widely in the sociology of higher education, and her recent books include Constructing the Higher Education Student, Perspectives from Across Europe, Student Migrants and Contemporary Educational Mobilities, and Reimagining the Higher Education Student. Rachel is a member of the Governing Council of the Society for Research into Higher Education and the Economic and Social Research Council, which is the UK's national social science funding body, and was a member of the education sub-panel for the UK's national research assessment exercise. And Rachel, I want to thank you very much for joining us this afternoon on a topic that's very, very interesting, and one that everyone grapples with, I think, in universities across Europe. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Marie, and thank you everyone for coming along this afternoon. I'm just going to share my slides. Is that looking okay? You can see those? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so yes, as Marie said, my paper is called European Higher Education Students Contested Constructions, and just a bit of background to start off. So as you probably know, it's argued within the academic literature that across Europe and indeed across the world, national higher education systems have become more similar as a result of processes associated with neoliberalization and marketization, and also the commodification of learning. And it's often argued that students have become much more similar as a result of this, as a consequence of being increasingly positioned as instrumental employment-focused consumers. And this is explained in terms of specific policy technologies, for example, the introduction of high fees in many parts of the world, policy discourses that have kind of, emphasized student rights as consumers in some countries. And also, as Joanna Williams has argued, the view of education, not just as a kind of, an important social function in itself, but as a means to various non-educational ends. And so her argument is, as a result of this, the liberal purpose of higher education, the emphasis on knowledge generation, is being squeezed out. And it's argued that as a result of these kind of changes, learning itself has been fundamentally restructured, I suppose. And right in relation to the English context, Molesworth and colleagues have argued that this kind of inculcation of a consumer identity in the UK has brought about a more passive approach to learning, in which students place much more emphasis on their rights rather than responsibilities, and on having a degree rather than being a learner. And although that is, perhaps more emphasised in the English context, writers from other nations have made similar arguments too. When we move on to thinking about the European context specifically, I think we can see similar types of arguments being played out about the increasing similarity of students. So, for example, when we think about the Erasmus scheme, I think there are certain assumptions implicit in this, that students can move unproblematically across national borders and kind of just pick up their education wherever they choose to study for their Erasmus year or semester abroad. But it's also been argued that in relation to particular European initiatives, such as the Bologna process and the European higher education area, there has been an aim to establish a much more homogenous higher education landscape. And Slaughter and Cantwell have argued in their analysis of EU policy in this area that they see this kind of reverse engineering of an Anglo-American model across Europe. And similarly, it's been argued that these kind of policy changes have had an impact on student subjectivities too. So, for example, Stavros Moutsios has argued that in relation to the Bologna process, This has positioned staff as a kind of workforce under surveillance, but also positioned students as consumers. So that kind of argument is made in relation to Europe too. But I did want to kind of just note some kind of different arguments in relation to the kind of literature in this area at this point in the presentation. So various scholars, including Grit Nielsen, writing in relation to the Danish context, have argued that policies are not always translated simply into student subjectivities, that actually there are lots of other things that go on that inform a student identity or a student subjectivity. Secondly, some people have argued that European higher education policy shouldn't be conceived as this kind of rolling out of an Anglo-American model. Actually, when we look at how it's acted in practice, it's often been a kind of a cultural script that different policy actors in different countries have kind of chosen to use for their own national ends. And then finally, there's a body of literature that points to the fact that nations are not always coherent educational entities, and that actually we can see, different approaches, different impacts, even with a single nation state. And so Diane Ray's work, for example, has pointed out the importance of differences within institutions, the institutional differentiation across a nation state. And a whole variety of colleagues have pointed out that, what it means to be a student can differ even within a single institution between different groups of students. So really, that's the kind of background in which the project that I'm going to be talking about was situated. And the project is called the Eurostudents project. It was funded by the European Research Council and finished last year after starting in 2016. So quite a long period of time. And one of the research questions that the project set out to answer was, how do students of different national backgrounds understand the role of the higher education student? And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So in the project, we collected data in 6 nations, Denmark, England, Germany, Ireland, Poland, and Spain. And they were chosen, I'll show you this slide shortly, to have diversity in relationship to the European Union, but also with respect to higher education, differences in terms of how higher education was funded and the type of support that was given to students, as well as kind of difference in welfare regime generally. I'll say a bit more about that in a second. In each country, we collected data in 3 higher education institutions, chosen to give some diversity in terms of institutional type and status. We tried to reflect what we felt were the kind of key dimensions of difference nationally in our institutional sample. And then in each institution, we conducted interviews with staff. I'm not going to be talking about them so much today, but also 3 focus groups with undergraduate students. So a total of 54 focus groups across the project as a whole, involving 295 students. And one of the things that we did in the focus groups was we asked students to make a plasticine model, both of how they saw themselves as a student and how they felt they were seen by others. And I'll be drawing on that data as well as the focus group discussions in the presentation. In the wider project, we also collected data about higher education policy through analysis of policy documents, interviewing policymakers, the media through analysis of national newspapers, and also TV shows and films that figured students prominently. And as I said, institutional perspectives through interviewing staff, but we also did a website analysis too. I'll make a few links to those other types of data in the presentation, but I'm going to be mainly focusing on the focus group data, but happy to answer any questions that you might have afterwards. Just a little bit more about the country selection. So there is no need to read all of this detail here, but I suppose this is just meant to illustrate the type of diversity we had in the 6 countries. So in terms of welfare regime, accession to the European Union, the extent to which undergraduates have to pay fees or not, and then the types of student support that's offered to students or not. And I suppose one of the things that became most important across the project as a whole, I suppose, was the payment of fees. So we have a kind of a range from Denmark on one hand with no tuition fees, through to England at the other end of the extreme with very high fees, and Ireland in the kind of officially no tuition fees, but a fairly significant student contribution at the time we were doing research. So again, happy to answer questions on that when we come back to it. But in terms of the kind of arguments I want to make today, I want to talk about how students themselves understood what it means to be a student in their countries today. And I suppose I want to argue that in some ways we see quite important similarities across all six nations, and I've listed some of the kinds of dominant constructions there, and the ones in yellow are the ones I'll be talking about today. But I also want to make the argument that despite some of those similarities, we also see quite pronounced cross-national differences, and there are three particular constructions that I'll be talking about there. There were also some differences by institution. I don't have time, I don't think, to talk about those in the presentation, but again, happy to answer any questions that you have about those in the Q&A at the end, because I think our argument is that the national differences were perhaps the most interesting, and then also perhaps also the national similarities, but in a few countries we did see institutional differentiation too, and there are some interesting reasons for that. So what I'm going to do now in the presentation is really to kind of go through those constructions one by one, and to show you some data to illustrate what I'm talking about, and then also to pull out some kind of more analytical thoughts about each one of those before concluding. So I'm going to start with students as learners. And as I said, there are some examples from our plasticine modelling here to illustrate what students said in the focus group. So here, actually in all 6 countries, numerous focus group participants made models that represented in some way the learning they were undertaking and how they saw this as fundamental to them, to what it means to be a student. And so the models included books, laptops, brains, trees, and flowers. There were also a number of models of pathways indicative of the student's suggested moving forwards, although sometimes to an unknown destination. So just some examples here to show you, one from England, where the student made a model of a book and said, I've been really surprised by how much I feel like my subject has come to define me, and how much genuinely of what I talk about is my subject and things that I've discovered that I'm really interested in, and to be proud of that. And then a Danish student made a little fellow with a big brain, as they said. You get a lot of knowledge all the time, and sometimes your brain is bigger than your face and you can't control it. So again, a way of representing the importance of learning and knowledge acquisition to them. A couple of other examples here, and I suppose these focus a little bit more on kind of knowledge rather than kind of the process of studying. So the one on the left from Germany, the student talked about making this abstract model. Important to have a lot of colours, because while I'm studying, I've noticed I'm discovering so much diversity and lots of different ways of life, and I'm discovering a lot about myself too, things I wouldn't otherwise be able to access because before everything was prescribed. So a sense that the learning that they were doing at university was actually quite different from school-based learning, with much more freedom to explore. And then finally, the example from Poland, where the student made a graduation cap to represent the gaining of knowledge and experience. And the student said, this cap symbolises my more academic attitude to learning things, something more than just getting over with these studies and moving on without taking advantage of this knowledge. So I think it's quite interesting, I think, that this emphasis on learning and the acquisition of knowledge was evident even in countries with more marketized systems, such as England. And I think this centrality of learning in the student narratives contrasted quite strongly with the noticeable absence of models that foregrounded things like employment, the positioning of students as future workers, or seeing students in more instrumental terms. And I think here there are clear differences between the dominant narratives that we saw within the policy texts that we analysed. So in these policy texts, we've argued that the construction of students as future workers is often dominant, and those of students as learners is frequently marginal or not even talked about at all in policy texts. And also our data from higher education staff also underlined the prevalence of understanding students in quite instrumental terms rather than terms of their approach to their studies. I think there are also clear contrasts here with the way in which students are often discussed in the literature, which I alluded to a little bit earlier, with some scholars portraying them as first and foremost consumers aware of their rights. And I think the emphasis on the value of knowledge and truth, even in supposedly kind of post-truth times, which was evident within the student narratives, also diverges quite considerably from Joanna Williams' argument, which I also mentioned earlier, that with respect to the UK in particular, the liberal purpose of higher education, i.e. the focus on knowledge for its own sake, has been squeezed out as a result of the use of the university system for other ends. And so in general, I think from our student data, a very positive view of higher education was communicated, in which students valued it for its impact on their intellect and their view of the world. So that was perhaps the most dominant construction that came through our student data. But another one that was also really important was students as hard workers. And this, again, was evident across all of the 6 countries in the sample. And so here, students emphasised the demanding amount and level of work that was required of them by their courses and how they had risen to this challenge. And this is illustrated by some of the examples I've put on the slides here. So the first one, the one on the left, is from Ireland, where the student has made a model of the laptop kind of attached to their head. And they said, that's me with the laptop. That's basically what I do all day. That's how I fall asleep. That's how I wake up. Basically, I study, I program, that's it. There's not much else, and there's not much time for anything else. And then a similar sentiment, I suppose, was communicated through a different type of model from Denmark. And the student said here, it's a snake eating its own tail. Even though I'm moving forward, I might be learning more, but then I realize I still need to learn more. I still need to improve. So this kind of constant cycle of learning and never quite learning enough. A couple of other examples here, one on the left from Poland. The student said, my model is a book with a cup of tea. I have to put a lot of effort into learning and so on, and I sacrifice a whole lot of time, despite not having a lot of classes at the university. And then on the right, an example from England, the student said, I just see myself as studying all the time because my course is just so intense, like we have lectures all the time, and then you have to go home and just like study, like to prepare yourself. So while various commentators have argued that under conditions of marketisation, students have increasingly come to see a degree as a product to be bought rather than a process of learning which requires effort on their part, the models that I've just presented to you suggest that not only did the focus group participants view the processes of learning as central to their understanding of what it means to be a student, but they also viewed it as not always easy and often requiring considerable effort. And in general, there was no attempt to position themselves as kind of effortless achievers as a means of demonstrating their authentic intelligence, as has been documented in numerous examples of compulsory education and some of higher education as well. And instead, I think the students' narratives would appear to offer some support to the argument made by Heather Mendick and colleagues that for many young people under conditions of what they call austere meritocracy, hard work has come to be seen as a key moral imperative. And by this, they mean that an emphasis on working hard reflects the language of politicians, in which the appeal to hard work has been used to sort of shore up the idea of meritocracy, but also to deflect responsibility for social inequalities back to the individual. And I think within higher education policy, specifically, the idea of hard work has indeed been discussed by politicians and other social actors. In England, for example, an implicit contrast is drawn by those students who work hard and are thoroughly deserving of their degree outcome, and others who have not shown such commitment and yet have been unfairly rewarded with a good degree as a result of so-called grade inflation. And similarly in Denmark, the figure of the lazy student has been used as a kind of foil for introducing a range of reforms intended to encourage students to move through their studies at a faster pace. While across Europe more generally, I think, reforms associated with the Bologna process have sought to increase the efficiency with which students move through their higher education, with implied consequences for how hard they're expected to work. And so I think it's possible that such discourses serve to underline the expectation of hard work, but also through the assertion that some students are lazy, provoke a reaction in which individuals are at pains to stress their hard-working nature. So I'm now going to move on to a few areas in which we see differences between countries. So I've been talking about similarities so far, but I'm going to move on to some differences. And the first country I want to draw on is Spain. And it was really interesting when we looked at the data that in most cases, most of the models where students were talking about their own identity conveyed a very positive understanding of what it means to be a higher education student. But the Spanish students were noticeably different. And instead, they tended to be critical of the higher education experience they were receiving, and also pessimistic about where their degree would lead them. So just some examples here. The one on the left, the student says, "I see myself alone in the middle of nothing. I have no idea about anything, nor how am I going to finish what I'm studying, nor what to do afterwards, nor what I like." And then the one on the right seemed to us, a really kind of extreme representation. The student said, "I've made a kind of dead figure, like a skull. I don't know if you can see it, but the face is a skull and it's dragging itself along in desperation because it's trying to arrive and it can't. And it has wings, but they are drooping." Now, I think the contrast with the models produced in the other 5 countries is striking. And when we were trying to kind of explain why Spain seemed so different from the other 5 countries, I suppose there were 2 kind of explanations that we thought were most plausible. The first relates, I think, to the high rate of youth unemployment in Spain. At the time we were doing our data collection in Spain, the youth unemployment rate was more than double the EU average. It was 34.3% in Spain, and the EU average was 15.2%. And it was the highest of all the countries in our study by over 20%. It also had a very high, similarly high rate of graduate employment too. And although the quotations on the previous slide don't make specific reference to the labour market, I think it is implicit in some of those comments about having no idea what to do afterwards, and the comment about kind of trying to arrive, but it can't. Some students were more direct, however, noting that there were insufficient jobs available for all those who graduated with good grades. And the example that I've put on the slide there illustrates this. So the student said, "I've made a briefcase which symbolises work, and a tick which represents good qualifications and grades. All is encircled, but there's a narrow opening. So I see myself as one of the thousands of young Spanish people who work, who study, who get good results. But in the end, we're all inside the same circle, and there is only a narrow exit. So it's a competition, more, and more, always more. It's never enough." So meaning that actually they felt quite pessimistic about getting a good job afterwards, despite kind of having worked hard, having good qualifications. So for us, that kind of contextual difference seemed one possible explanation for the much more pessimistic view of what it means to be a student in Spain compared to the other countries. And I suppose the other explanation that we came up with was perhaps the combination of perceived poor pedagogy and relatively high fees. So Spanish students' dissatisfaction appeared also to be linked to a combination of this what they perceived to be quite high fees many of them were paying, combined with what they also perceived as the poor quality education they were receiving. And there were lots of comments about both of these in the wider focus group discussions. And so interestingly, although fees were much higher in England, They did not have to be paid upfront like the fees in Spain did. And also in England, students were much more contented about the content of their degree programmes. And again, just to illustrate this kind of sentiment from the Spanish students, there's a model there where the student said, "My model, it's a sad and frustrated dull because I believe they have to change the teaching methodology that they use in class. It has to be more dynamic, different, not the typical one of coming here, sitting down and listening to all they tell you." And it was quite interesting that it was only really in Spain where there was this kind of critique of the education they were receiving. In all of the other countries, students on the whole felt much more positive about the quality of their education. The second national difference I want to talk about also relates to Spain, but focuses on the construction of students as consumers. And this consumerism was talked about explicitly only really in Spain, not in any of the other countries, which we found really intriguing because we didn't expect that. Because obviously marketisation is more firmly established in many of the other countries, or several of the other countries, England and perhaps Ireland, when compared to Spain. And indeed, when we did our analysis of the higher education institution websites, our analysis indicated that Spanish students, unlike their counterparts in England, Ireland and Denmark, were not addressed as consumers, but more as kind of novices in an academic community or recipients of a public service. And when we interviewed Spanish policymakers, they tended to be strongly opposed to a consumerist discourse. And also when we look at kind of the media discourse, marketisation is discussed very little in the media in Spain. So it was really odd to us that students talked in these terms. So in the examples here, on the one on the left, the students talk about kind of ascending to the top of the slide because they're learning. But when they get to the top, they have a series of problems and they end up as just a kind of a consumer product for the system. And then the one on the right, the student made a model of a cardboard box. And they said, "I feel about myself as if what I've tried to make, a cardboard box, to show that I feel like a piece of merchandise in this educational situation, which in the end is more of an attempt at the commercialisation of education than of learning." And as I said, to us, this seemed like a paradox because of the way marketisation is more firmly established in other countries, and that students didn't seem to be addressed as consumers by either universities themselves, policymakers, or the media. And so I think perhaps in kind of exploring some of the reasons why we might see this, it's possible that the stage of marketisation is significant. In England, for example, market reforms and consumer discourse are so firmly established that ideas of marketisation might have become so normalised that they're not worthy of comment by students. In Spain, however, because it's kind of, in some ways moving towards a marketised system, but it's not as firmly as embedded in other countries, there might be heightened sensitivity and resistance to such ideas because they are relatively new and not yet firmly established in all parts of the higher education system. And I think here there might be some reflection of Manuel Klemenchik's argument that national political norms can affect what's seen as an acceptable education policy, and conversely, what is met with resistance and opposition. Spanish students might also be aware of the trajectory taken by higher education systems elsewhere in Europe and keen to avoid shifting to this highly marketised system. And I think, finally, the distinctiveness of the Spanish data might also relate to the ways in which higher education is funded. As I've mentioned earlier, fees are relatively high in Spain and payable upfront by a relatively large proportion of the student population. However, unlike in other countries where relatively high fees are payable, England and Ireland, in Spain there was also this widespread dissatisfaction with the quality of the education that's received. And it seems to me that this kind of combination may have caused students to question the basis of fees, i.e. a consumerist system in which higher education is understood at least partially as an individual good, than in nations where students are more broadly happy with the education they're receiving. So I want to move on now to the third national difference, and here we're moving away from Spain to Poland. And in Poland, students were broadly in line with their counterparts in the other 5 nations in emphasising the importance of learning and hard work to their understandings of what it means to be a student, and their relatively upbeat assessment of their lives. But they differed from their peers in the other 5 countries in suggesting that there was nothing intrinsically different about being a student. Students were just people like everybody else. And this is illustrated by the model on the left. The student says, I've made a regular person because I think that every student is just a regular person. And the fact that you're attending university doesn't make you special in any way. That's it. Other students in Poland focused on particular characteristics that they had, which had no obvious connection to being a student. And so the example on the right illustrates this, where the student said, I formed a person because I see myself as an outgoing person and someone that needs other people to feel good, and I'm always at the centre of attention. And these kinds of comments were wholly absent from the focus groups in the other 5 countries, where typically all participants considered that there was something specific about being a student, even if the nature of that differed. And I think this is really interesting in Poland because it corresponds to what we observed as a kind of a lack of discussion of students within the national media. There were very few newspaper articles in Poland about students per se, contrasting quite starkly with the other 5 countries. And also their representation in Polish TV shows and films was also minimal. So these kind of common patterns across the different strands of data collection. So why might this be? So I think, first of all, again, these are kind of, possible explanatory factors, and it might be interesting to hear your views. But I suppose the first might relate to some changes to the higher education system in Poland over the past decade. So Poland differs from most of its European neighbours by the sharp rate of increase in higher education participation that's occurred over the past 30 years. So, for example, in 1989, only 10% of each age cohort progressed to university, whereas now the comparable figure is around 50%. So although the current level isn't significantly higher than many other European countries, the rate of increase has been notably higher. And I think this might have led to a perception amongst Poles that now that everyone is going to university, it's no longer associated with any special social status. And indeed, a recent survey conducted in Poland indicated that around over 3/4 of people interviewed, 78%, believe that everyone can study, perhaps linked not only to the sharp increase in the percentage of each cohort going on to university, but also the perceived ease of accessing most courses, even in prestigious universities, which is a kind of common perception across Poland. It's also possible, I think, that these students' views might be informed by the legacy of its communist past, in which no elite groups were recognised and individuals were seen only as peasants, workers or intellectual workers. But also, I think it's interesting to reflect on the prevalence of paid work alongside studies in the lives of many Polish students, and how this might also affect their perspectives. So there's an interesting study conducted by Berkins et al. In Estonia, and they argued that paid work was much more significant to students than their higher education studies, largely because students believe employers view the work experience as a much more important marker of their abilities than their degree result. And although the level of student employment in Poland is similar to that in some other of the countries in our sample, the documented belief among the population at large that a degree now has low labour market value may encourage students to foreground their worker identity rather than their student identity. And indeed, there's been some research not conducted by us, but by another project which asked students whether they identify primarily as a student or a worker. And it was really interesting that Poland was a real outlier, with many more people, many more students identifying as a worker than a student. So, for example, the percentage choosing the worker identity was almost half of all students in Poland, compared with 25% in Ireland and only 9% in Denmark. And then finally, when we were doing our data collection, we thought that there might be some institutional assumptions feeding into this, because it was really noticeable to us when we were doing our data collection in Polish universities that there were very few social spaces available. So the photos there are the kind of, the only kind of communal spaces that we came across in this one particular university where we collected data. And so there's perhaps, this institutional assumption that, students, universities aren't places where you live the whole of your life. They're the places that you just come in to study. But again, I think, with this institutional assumption, cause and effect are a little hard to determine. So that takes me on to conclusions from the study. What can we kind of, what are some of the messages that we can take away from this? So first of all, I want to return to the debate that I talked about at the start about, increasingly similar students. Are we seeing increasingly similar students across Europe? And I think the data that I've presented today does speak to some of these debates about European homogenization, which I alluded to at the start of the presentation. There are clearly some commonalities, some important commonalities in conceptualisations of what it means to be a higher education student amongst our focus group participants from across Europe, particularly the centrality of learning and the importance of hard work. They were evident in most of our 54 focus groups. And I think this suggests that the majority of those involved in our research had a rather less instrumental view of education that is sometimes suggested within the literature, and were committed to putting in a sufficient degree of effort to ensure they got the best out of their degree programme. But I think that these commonalities have to be set against some of the differences that were also evident in our study. And as I've just been saying, many Spanish students differed from their counterparts in the other 5 countries in having a markedly less positive view about what it means to be a higher education student. And they were also more likely than their peers in other nation states to make reference to ideas associated with consumerism and marketisation. And as I've just been mentioning most recently, national differences were also evident in Poland, with participants typically conceptualising students as little different from other members of society. Whereas in all other countries, students were much more likely to identify a range of characteristics that they thought were specific to higher education students. And so taken together, I think these differences do raise questions about the extent to which higher education systems are converging as a result of the Bologna process and the creation of a European higher education area, as scholars such as Moutsios and Slaughter and Cantwell have argued. Or, even if we're seeing convergence at the policy level, is that actually impacting on student subjectivities too? And so it seems when we explore these student understandings, there do remain quite interesting differences, which are informed by the particular histories of nation states and their specific social, political and economic contexts. As well as speaking to debates about the degree of coherence and convergence across Europe, the data also, I think, inform our understandings or our views about the extent to which nations can be viewed as sharing common understandings of students. And the disconnect between policy emphases that I talked a little bit about, the kind of foreground student as worker, more instrumental understandings of students, and students' understandings themselves, I think that raises questions about whether nations can be understood as these kind of coherent educational entities that I mentioned at the start, and suggests that what it means to be a student in contemporary society can in some countries be understood quite differently between policy actors on one hand and students themselves on the other. And then finally, going back to kind of the debate about students as consumers. So as I said at the start of the presentation, some scholars have argued that as a result of market reforms across Europe, students have become increasingly consumerist in their outlook. But I think the plasticine models produced by our participants were generally much more ambivalent about these kind of discussions. Although their emphasis on hard work can be read, as I argued, as a kind of internalisation of neoliberal imperatives, and in some cases a reflection of the language used by policymakers, I think this reading is kind of in tension with the non-instrumental focus implicit in the emphasis of many students on their love of learning and their sense that it was this that was central to their identity as higher education students. And I think in these kind of cases, we see the strength of more traditional understandings of the purpose of higher education being played out amongst students, which foreground ideas about knowledge acquisition and personal growth rather than labour market readiness. And I think it's intriguing that the understandings of students as consumers came not from the countries that are typically assumed to have the most firmly entrenched market-based systems, such as England and possibly Ireland, or those where higher education institutions tended to treat students as consumers, as evident in our analysis of university websites, but from Spain, where market reforms have been introduced relatively late and policymakers resistant to consumer discourse. And so in explaining this variation, I suggested that the broader economic context may be key, and the students may come to understand their position very differently if they're concerned about their labour market outcomes. But also it might be the case that the specific stage of policy implementation is important, with students in Spain more concerned about the impact of marketisation because it has yet to be normalised nationally. And I've contrasted this with England, where market logic has informed the higher education sector for a long time, and so might either not be noticed or not deemed worthy of comment by students. So taken together, I think the data that I've been talking about this afternoon indicate that differences between students in different nation states cannot easily be read off policy pronouncements and formal policy positions. Moreover, I think it suggests that there's not always a straightforward relationship between policy and student subjectivities, and that to understand the experiences of being a student in contemporary Europe, we need to look beyond policy and political rhetoric to the lived experiences of individuals. So I'll finish there. Be good to hear your comments, observations, questions. But if you'd like to find out more, we have a project website, and then the specific arguments I've been talking about today are discussed in our book, which is open access from the Policy Press website, and also in a particular article that was published in Sociological Research Online in 2021. So thank you very much for listening, and looking forward to the Q&A.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rachel. And I'll hand over to David now, who'll chair our Q&A for us. Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you, and thank you very much for an interesting. I'm fascinated by the fact that it's in Poland or in Spain, it's almost the absence of information that has informed their opinion. It's a really curious kind of thing. And I kind of wonder out loud in terms of what is it that our students don't know or haven't been exposed to that actually informs them. It seems that kind of, strange kind of anomaly in terms of their kind of processing. It's something that they see elsewhere but haven't actually experienced informs what they feel right now. But with that aside, if anyone has a question, please feel free to take the floor and ask directly a question to Rachel. I have one to kick off, actually, Rachel. The Polish interpretation of themselves, the one particular one that took me was the student creating themselves as an ordinary person, and yet their brain was exposed. I'm puzzled in terms of how you actually kind of, or how you were able to interpret some of the models. What was your methodology or process in that?
Yeah, no, that's an important question. And I suppose the models have been great for sort of illustrating talks and putting on slides, but I suppose we analysed it by relying primarily on the student's description of the model. And that's really kind of, what we what we focused on, because I think, yes, that there were kind of quite big differences in artistic ability and, you know, that kind of thing. So, for example, the fact that the brain was exposed, that wasn't commented on at all by the student, and it wasn't something that we analysed, because we felt that it was important that students, you know, we took students' descriptions of what their models were about at face value. I mean, I think that, you know, there are obviously other approaches to kind of using creative methods in social research, but it was very much we used the plasticine model as a mechanism for students. I suppose there are a number of reasons to make kind of tangible, potentially quite abstract ideas, but also to kind of, you know, force them to focus on one construction, because we did this at the start, and then in the focus group we asked them a lot of different questions, many quite wide-ranging, and in the course of those discussions lots of different constructions of students got discussed. But I suppose with the plasticine model we were quite keen that they told us about what they saw as most important to them, or the kind of, you know, most I don't know, the most important way in which they saw themselves as students. So I feel it was quite successful in that respect, but I think because of the kind of, you know, different degrees of artistic ability, we chose not to kind of analyze the models as kind of pieces of kind of, you know, art in themselves or representations, just to focus primarily on what the students said about them.
Okay, super. Anyone else have a question? Yes.
Hello, Rachel. Thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. Really enjoyed it. I'm interested in the last point you're making about the disconnect between student understandings and policy. And I just wonder, are there any implications of your research for policy development in higher education?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I suppose I think that, you know, there are some implications. I think, first of all, kind of, you know, I do think it highlights the importance of listening to students, because I think, you know, policymakers, but also I think, you know, just think about my own institution, higher education staff as well, we do often assume that it is kind of the job afterwards that is the most important thing to them, and that's kind of what's driving them. And I think our research would suggest that actually students do put much more emphasis on the process of learning of itself and the knowledge acquisition than perhaps they're given credit for. So I think that is important that we listen to those kind of things coming from students, and, you know, making sure that at the university level that our courses, you know, we don't drive out that kind of behaviour by too many kind of employability initiatives. But I think also within public discourse that, you know, that the kind of, you know, the more public function of higher education, the public good, is recognised, because I think that did come through from the student perspective. It's not all about kind of, you know, just getting the good job afterwards. So I think there are some kind of, you know, messages for policymakers in recognising that students do perhaps have a different view from that's communicated sometimes in policy documents, but also that higher education itself is valued for these you know, the learning, the actual education, rather than just a means to an end. And I think sometimes that's lost. And I think actually in our focus groups and other parts of the focus group discussion, there was quite a lot of kind of critique of policymakers for having such an instrumental view of higher education. And I think that then also raises questions about kind of, you know, legitimacy of political leaders, the disconnect politically between students and those who are making decisions about them. So I think there are perhaps some broader issues there as well.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
Any further questions?
Where does the research go from here, Rachel? This is going to be a lifelong commitment.
Yeah, that's a good question. So this ended kind of last summer. We're still writing up a few little bits from it, but I mean, I suppose, you know, I am quite interested in kind of European higher education as a phenomenon. So I'm working on a project at the moment that's looking at the European Universities Initiative. So the idea to, you know, establish these kind of European universities that bring together lots of different national universities into a kind of a single entity. And we've looked at that so far from the kind of the policy perspective and the staff perspective, but I am quite interested in how students perceive that, because one thing I didn't really talk about at all today was about kind of how they position themselves relative to kind of, you know, wider Europe. And I think, you know, there are given what I've said about sort of national differences, I think there are some questions about kind of if you are going to have these kind of, you know, mega European universities, how that kind of relates to national understandings of students and national policies. So that's kind of one strand of work. And I suppose another thing that I found really interesting that we didn't really have time to explore in this project was different national cultures around the role of the family in kind of student life, how students were understood, the extent to which students were seen as kind of independent individuals versus still kind of embedded in families. And actually this came up quite a bit in the Irish data, with kind of differing views about, you know, whether it was a good thing if students were kind of very independent, or whether actually, you know, it was much better that they were seen as kind of, you know, supported by their family living at home and that kind of thing. And I think there are some really interesting cultural differences across Europe in relation to the extent to which students are seen as independent individuals. And that relates also to kind of, you know, assumptions made about funding by different policy regimes there. So I think that's something that family relationships is something that I think we didn't have much chance to explore in the project, but I did find quite intriguing, and I think underpins some of these different national differences we see across Europe. For example, about, you know, whether it's expected that students are living in the family home or not, and therefore, you know, what it's fair to ask students or their families to pay for university. So I think that kind of family relationship and variation across Europe is quite interesting too.
And thank you very much. You're going to be very busy with all of that, and it's wonderful.